Well, hello, folks. Welcome. And thanks for stopping by on another Tuesday evening. Another live show. I've got Veronica teed up, ready to come in just a moment or two. We'll just go into pre-show mode for a little while, just to give people a chance to come. We've got about 300 in and out so far, which is good. And you got a few views of the old doggies, but here's a full screen version of it. So they are alive, believe it or not. You... Meteor's having a little bit of a sort of a go. Luna is sound asleep. I took them out a little while ago, so that's why they're a bit pooped now. They've been out for 3 or 4 walks today, so we've dodged the rain. But there you go, that's the old doggies. And we're going to have a very interesting conversation this evening. I was just saying to Veronica, in all of my years thinking about property and related issues, I don't think I've ever seen such a complex situation we've got now. So lots to talk about and lots of questions we can explore tonight. I've also got a few questions that people sent to me beforehand, and we'll cover those as we go through. Plus, of course, we'll be able to ask questions in the chat as normal. So without further ado, let me get rid of the pre-show and run the intro. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 9th of August 2022. As you may notice, I've occasionally said 2021. I'm a year behind, but I got it right tonight, so that's good. And thanks for coming in and spending some time with us. Very interesting conversation, important conversation today about property and related aspects. Just before I bring Veronica in, I will just remind you, as I always do, that on the show here, we don't provide specific financial or legal or property advice. Do please play nice in the chat room. We do moderate the stream. This is at the 9th of August 2020 if you're watching in replay. If you'd like to ask a question, please say @WhatTheWorld at the start of it. That'll get my attention, make sure that I see it. And if you would like to get your question top of the queue, you can use the smart chat to do that, or indeed make a contribution to help us with what we do here, because we don't do this for profit. We do this because we think it's important. So there you go. Anyway, without further ado, let's get rid of that and bring Veronica in. Veronica, hello.
Well, hello. Nice to see you.
Very nice to have you back on the show. I was looking back, we had a conversation nearly 3 months ago, right? And at that stage, interest rates were, extremely low. People were getting 2% mortgages. Property prices were, pretty good. Consumer confidence wasn't bad either. And since then, it's all turned to water, isn't it, really?
And mush.
But there you go. Anyway, welcome. Thanks very much for spending some of your time. And look, for those who don't know, let me just give you a chance to introduce yourself, because you've got so many irons in the fire, I can't possibly cover them all.
It's actually really bad now, Martin. I actually don't even know how to introduce myself anymore. I'm not I am a real estate agent. I am a buyer's agent, but I'm also a property educator, and I've got a podcast, 2 podcasts, in fact. And I guess my passion is to help people make really good property decisions. There's a lot of misinformation out there. One of the reasons I love you and all the work you do is that you really want to cut through all the crap and get to the heart of it. And so I do. So all the different things that I work on are all about that and helping people make good decisions around property. So I'm not sure I've actually articulated. I've got to work on my pitch.
But I actually think cutting the crap's a good way to think about it, right? I don't know, you probably didn't notice, but over the weekend I actually interviewed a very, very bullish property person, right? And I took them to task because, people said to me, you never have property bulls on your channel. So, well, let's get a property bull. So I got somebody on, right? And basically the pitch was property always goes up. It's going to go up. It's the best time to buy. And so I sort of started lobbing in that, well, actually, what about these, and clearly it was like, there's no point. there is just no point, because, we will never agree, because, his particular blinkered view of the world was such that you could never actually break out of it. So it just shows you how difficult this task is.
It is. And, I've been accused of being a property bear by a property bull, which is really quite hilarious. Oh, dear. When you are biased and you just believe a certain thing, you can't disabuse people of that notion. And unfortunately, a lot of people are really keen on this whole idea of getting rich getting rich through property, and they're seduced by that enthusiasm, and, you know, it doesn't always pay off for people. Anyway, so, yeah, I think it is interesting to see what's changed in the last 3 months, I have to say. And honestly, I've been watching the headlines in this time, and I've been really, really infuriated by the headlines. I know that all those headline producers are probably chasing you down because they love you at times like this, Martin. But I really have been infuriated. I think that they are more useless than ever, and more encouraging more knee-jerking than ever. And that is annoying me. But at the same time, you know, it is what it is, isn't it? This is the environment in which we live, and we just have to deal with that.
Yeah, well, I think people need to understand, of course, that some of these headline writers, and particularly the online media, they're out for eyeballs, right?
Of course.
And they know what can actually attract people to go look at a page. And that's all they're really interested in, right? So whether it's a version of the truth or not, and whether it's the whole truth or not, is irrelevant, right? And if you think about the main portals as well, you know, and the writers around the main portals, they're about eyeballs. They're about getting people to go look. So it's really important to understand that social media-itis has absolutely infected property from top to bottom.
Yeah, 100%. And it comes down to the journalism industry as well. I mean, that's been decimated. So there's not as many journalists. The profession of journalism and investigative journalism isn't as highly rewarded and respected as it used to be. There's not enough money in it for them to do it properly. And so you'll get a lot of property articles that are basically created directly off a press release. Yep. And there's no interrogation of that data or testing to see if it's accurate or even an attempt to understand it. So, you know, of course, then you get, I guess I've had the benefit of, through the Elephant in the Room, the podcast, doing so many interviews with Kent Larder in particular, who's a property data specialist, been in that game for decades. And I've really learned so much about the misuse and misuse of statistics. And so I'm very thankful for that introduction myself and my own learning in that way, because it does help me actually interrogate a lot of the data that comes under my nose that previously I would have believed.
And look, I think that it's really important to lay out a few fundamental principles, right? Principle one, there is no such thing as the property market. There are a whole series of property markets across the country, right? More so than probably ever before. Secondly, not all properties within a market are the same. And they don't behave the same, and they won't behave the same. Thirdly, there are some fundamental differences about whether you're investing or whether you're buying for yourself, for own occupation. And the last one is how long you want to actually hold the property for becomes a very critical conversation point, particularly now. And you can start to lay out some of those fundamental points. And it's interesting. I'll just put this one up here because it was actually quite fascinating. This is from Brutus, saying, should we be more focused on evaluating property market based on location, like Sydney versus Brisbane versus Gold Coast, etc. That's part of it, but you've got to go a whole lot further than that, don't you, Veronica?
Yeah. It is actually, it's quite fascinating. One of the number one question that we're usually asked is, where should I buy? And that sort of comes from investors, but it also comes from owner-occupiers, particularly first home buyers. And the answer to that question is never straightforward. And yet you've got lots of people out there peddling data and reports. And look, we create them in Suburb Help as well, which creates answering that question. The problem is, though, once you've sort of decided on a location, once you've decided on where you're going to, what your thesis is and basically what you believe to be the case and why you're focusing your attention on a location, you really need to actually get to become a local expert in that area to avoid buying a dog. Because I would hazard a guess, probably 95% of property from an investment point of view, and like you said earlier, the purpose of the purchase is very important. But from an investor's point of view, I would hazard 95% of property is not worth touching. Yeah. So how do you work out what 5% should I touch once you've learned, once you decided on a location?
Absolutely.
So, but I agree that there are different locations and they perform differently, behave differently. And, look at the way Brisbane's been behaving with this sort of post-lockdown boom or the 2021 boom. And it's still in growth, right? It hasn't yet, its growth has slowed, so you can see what's coming, but it's still growing in prices. And we're talking housing, not apartments here. Whereas Sydney, obviously, we peaked in January this year. That's now evident. And of course, we never know that till it's past tense because clearance rate still in early March was still above, I'm going back in memory here, but I think it was still above 70%. So that still said it's a seller's market. And yet price growth, the prices had peaked, but we didn't know that, for another, say, 2 or 3 months. So all this information. But so that behaved completely differently to Brisbane, and Melbourne somewhat similar in terms of its performance. But we're talking about a whole market. As we said before, they don't really exist. But within these markets, there are individual properties doing different things. You'll have people who will actually make money in a falling market, not through renovating, just because they bought the right asset. And you'll have other people lose money in a rising market because they bought a poor asset.
And that's the point. You can actually make the right decision and the wrong decision. They look both the same until you actually realise what you've done, right?
Well, that is exactly right. And the problem is that you talk about one of the big factors is how long you intend on holding on that property. Now, I can test that buying property is a long game. If you're thinking, I think even 5 years really is too short. But if you're thinking less than 5 years, don't buy. That's just nuts because you're taking far too many risks that the market may or may not sort of go in your favour. You might luck it, but you also may not luck it. And so it's a long-term game. And therefore, you've got to think long-term when you're making these decisions. And the problem is then also that you often won't know until some time has passed whether you did, in fact, make a good decision or not. And that's a danger with a lot of these property experts out there, which rabbit ears around experts. Really concerns me, back to the misuse of data quite often, in that they're encouraging people to make these purchasing decisions, and the buyers themselves won't know for a good 5 or 10 years whether they made a good decision or not. And those experts, will they still be around? Potentially not. They've moved on to the next get rich, quick scheme.
Yes, there are a few of those around, unfortunately. They come and they go. It's a bit like whack-a-mole, you sort of hit them over the head and disappear and they pop up over there again, But it is a very important, thing to underscore, this time question. I was talking to some people the other day in my one-on-one, and there were a couple, right, and they were sort of thinking about buying, but I asked them the question about what time frame were they thinking over, right? And one was saying, 18 months. The other was thinking 5 or 6, 7 years. And that got them into a very interesting bind because they suddenly realised that they were having completely different mental models as to how this is going to play out, right? So we had a very interesting conversation beyond that, which was, well, in 18 months, you won't even cover the costs of the transaction, right? Whereas 5, 6, 7 years, there's more chance of upside. And, very interesting just to understand that they hadn't really thought that through at all. It shows you with so many of these things, you've got to ask you a whole bunch of questions on the way in rather than sort of jump in and try and retrofit the answers later, because that often doesn't work.
And I do a lot, one-on-one strategy sessions as well with people, and it is quite astounding the beliefs that people enter into property with. I was talking to somebody only this week and they absolutely fixated on buying land, as in a house on land. But the property that they could afford in the area they really wanted to be in was completely and utterly unlivable. And I'm like, yes, that's great that you're buying land, but there are other alternatives in other suburbs where you can afford to have a dwelling that you can live in, because can you afford to actually renovate this property? Well, they couldn't afford to renovate it. So what they're going to do is just sit on it and pay a mortgage and land tax and all the it just didn't make any sense whatsoever. But they were so fixated on this one idea about land in this location, and they had completely bypassed any sort of a sensible conversation. It was a really deep set belief. I don't think I've disabused them of that. I mean, land is important, and land in an area where land is valuable is important, but what's on that land is also very important. And And this assumption that you can just renovate it at some point in the future, they had done no evaluation in terms of the possibilities, in terms of heritage overlays, and nothing. It's just the very fact that it was land, it was a certain size. They thought that was all they needed to worry about. They had enough money. They had quite a bit of money. They're not silly people. They're not unsuccessful people. But when it comes to property, they're completely out of depth. And this is just one of countless stories I could tell about people who have a lot of money. They go and spend it on property and then find out afterwards, oh, right, maybe I could have done something different.
Absolutely. And I often say part of the trouble is we don't buy property often enough to learn how to do it right? So, it's almost starting from scratch every time. But there's also a little bit of a sense of, I always find this really amazing, and I think I probably told you the story before. It amazes me how many people will spend a lot of time on the internet looking at the price of a new fridge, right, to save, $20, $30, $40 plus delivery, right? But when it comes to property, they sort of go in boots first thinking, well, it's simple, right? No. It's not quite like that.
Well, back to your bear and others who say the prices always go up. And it's like, yes, if you look at aggregated data on the whole of Australia or Sydney or Melbourne or even New South Wales, or maybe not Darwin, maybe not Perth. But if you look at aggregated data for most sort of large areas in this country, including the entire country, over time, over the decades, prices have always trended up, right? There's a period of time in the around World War II where they didn't. In fact, before World War II, interestingly enough, and you probably looked at all this stuff before, price growth was nowhere near as rapid as it's been since World War II. And in fact, I think it was in World War II, prices did go back to where they were, I think, in the 1920s or something. Yeah, well, so that would have been a pretty tough time for property owners.
If you take a 150-year view, right, it's about 2%.
Right, but if you take a 100-year view, it's like 8%, isn't it?
But if you take a 30-year view, it's gone through the roof, right? And that's because of the deregulation. That's because of the cutting of interest rates and the bringing in of the securitization, all of the things, all those financial engineering techniques and all of that stuff. That's why we've had this massive acceleration. And that's why over the last 2 years we had massive price acceleration, because rates were cut, credit was more available. And it's this fundamental principle that actually prices go up when credit is more readily available. The reverse is also true, of course. Now with interest rates rising and borrowing power reducing, credit is less available. That's one of the main reasons why prices are falling.
Well, we saw that happen in 2017, 18 and 19.
We did. Yep.
For different reasons. But
it's the same basic principle. Yeah. Investment lending was going too hot. They turned the dial down. Credit was less available. Prices came back. So there is a repeatable pattern here. And, one of my arguments over the weekend was, well, you've had this massive run-up over the last 18 months. Go back further, over 20 years. But that's completely that's explicable, right? But you can't tell me it's going to do the same again, because if you think about the average property price now relative to income, it's already off the scale. Well, if we do it again over the next 20 years, it'll be $1 billion to own a property and about 4 people will be able to own it. So that can't work.
Although we've got a shortage. So how do you explain that?
Well, do we have a shortage? That's an interesting question, right? So the ABS, in their census, there's 1 million spare properties across Australia. 1 million plus.
Yes.
Right? Plus the ones being built.
But what that says, though, is that clearly there's a lot of people that own property, 1 million potentially, that aren't subject to interest rates. They're not affected by interest rates, So we'll have to see what different type of rates they could be impacted by. I think the local councils do need to start actually in putting pressures on these people to make their properties available in the rental market. We've got a real crisis in this country.
Yeah, the rental crisis is what I've been focusing on. In fact, I did a show the other day on it, rental stress has gone through the roof. Literally in the last few months, it's more than half of households now are struggling with paying the rent. They're getting forced out. They're trying to find other places that are cheaper and have to move further out. So, that's a really big deal. But it's interesting, if you look in all the newspapers online, there's a 10-to-1 relationship between the rental story and the other mortgage stress story in the property, the broader property story. Rental stress is not being given the focus it needs, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, I've done a couple of podcasts on this. Megan and I did one for your first home buyer guide, and we came to the conclusion that we actually think the headlines are probably slightly understating this one, overstating fear in the actual the ownership side of the equation, and certainly they're not overstating this. But this is really interesting too, because this has been a long time brewing, as we've seen. It's been hiding in plain sight, and no one's noticed it. And interestingly enough, a lot of anecdotally, a lot of people have been saying, well, a story of a small town, one small town suffering a shortage of rental properties is really not a story, but it becomes a story when it's, every small town. And now we're starting to see it in the cities as well. I know in Brisbane it's been an issue for at least 12 months, probably longer.
Well, it's been going for quite some time. I saw it building in my surveys. So it was bad before COVID. It got worse. And then, of course, a lot of people who had Airbnb property couldn't do Airbnb, so they let them out longer term. So there was a little bit of a relief, and rents actually dropped during that period. So the rental sector got a bit of relief. But then towards the end of COVID, a lot of people then switched back to Airbnb and kick people out. And I'm getting stories now of people in rented accommodation with rental rises of 9, 15, 20% coming through. I mean, those are unsustainable, right? And of course, that's an interesting observation. That flows into the CPI, and that's one of the things that are now driving the CPI higher. So that's another inflationary factor that is often not spoken about, but should be. So no, this is a really big deal. And again, I don't think that the political sort of class are really thinking about this. The complexity here is that we don't have enough of the right properties in the right place at the right price point for people who are wanting to rent, let alone to buy. And I guess what's happened is that it's been left to the market, the private market, to sort of sort it out. And the private market, well, it tends to behave in a particular way, which means a lot of people get squeezed out. So I'm seeing a lot of people now having to move further away from where they want to work into less convenient locations so they can pay a little less. But then their other cost of living go up too, so they get caught. So it's got really, really difficult now for the rental sector.
Yeah, I tell you what, though, I do feel like individual private landlords, I know that's not a popular term anymore. I can't even remember what the PC term is for a landlord. I'll call myself a landlord, okay? Landlords and landladies. The private owned segment of investment properties, and they've copped a bit of flack. There's been a lot of disincentive coming from governments for individual investors, and think about it. Look, it's gone back to even before. Hang on, I'm trying to remember now when the negative gearing or the capital the depreciation changed. I think it might have been 2017. Now I'm thinking the budget.
About 4 years ago, I think,
Yeah. So that was the budget where basically it said, right, if you buy a used property per se, even if the oven's only 1 year old, if it's been used, then you can't claim the remaining 9 years of depreciation. But if you go and buy a brand new property, you can claim the lot. And so that's sort of, once again, it's a disincentive for people to buy established property. And then you've got Queensland with their land tax rules currently. It's like that just beggars belief. You've got a situation, we've got a shortage of investment properties or properties available in the the rental market, and then you go putting things like the imposts like that on investors. So investors get a bit of a bad rap of being fat cats and all the rest of it. But I think this has shown we've performed a very valuable service. And the government's got away without investing in social and community housing, largely because of this. So you sort of can't give with one hand and take away with the other. It's a bit of a tough one, that one. But I totally agree with you that the right properties in the right areas have not been developed. And now you've got situations, particularly in regional towns. I've heard anecdotally stories of doctor shortages, nurse shortages, teacher shortages, essential workers that can't get accommodation in towns. That's going to cause a real problem.
Well, that's right. Well, unfortunately, what's happened is that they just left it to the private market. Now, I agree with you. There are some very good landlords out there who are doing, or land persons. I don't know. It wasn't what the right term is.
Property, rental property provider, I think is potentially
whatever. We'll sort of hedge around it. But the point is, some of them have actually not put rents up. and they've said, look, I've got a good tenant, I want to keep that tenant, I'm happy to sit with that. But then you actually find that others who particularly are managed often by larger firms who are also taking a clip on the ticket, they seem to be much more aggressive in putting the rents up. So it does actually, not all landlords are equal, when it comes to looking at that.
I tell you something that really does annoy me, and that is when you hear commentary saying, well, interest rates are going up, and so that's going to make rents go up. It doesn't work that way. If the market cannot bear increased rents, you can't put rents up. Landlords just can't increase their rents because their costs go up, right? It actually doesn't happen that way. But right at the moment, there is opportunity for landlords to put rents up because there's a shortage, and there's high demand. So I know myself, I've got 2 properties that were where the rent was drastically reduced due to COVID, right? And they're in Sydney, and they're both currently at below market rent. So if I was to release those properties, I will get substantially more for both of them. Now, my tenants are benefiting from the fact that they, screwed a great deal for themselves when the market was in their favour. Yep. And now it's not. And I'd be foolish if I didn't do something. I'm not going to put those rents up to market rent where my leases are due, because they've both got really good tenants. But I am going to increase them because I don't want that gap to get too far either. There's other issues there in terms of just, what's the word, being sensible in terms of long term. They may stay there for 10 years. I've got to somehow keep it within the realms of market rent. But so me personally, and certainly my cash flow has been impacted because of that, and lots of other people have as well. And that's I didn't have rental properties in regional areas to benefit from that sort of windfall. But so it is, even the fact that you will have landlords put their rents up, it isn't because it's a money grab. And I think that there's a real tendency for the media to sort of do the woe is me and the evil landlord and all that sort of thing. And as I said, I will just reiterate that you can't put rents up if there's not enough market demand to sustain that at higher rent. It just doesn't work that way.
No, absolutely. Well, the long-term rentals tend to follow income.
Exactly right.
Not property prices, or not interest rates, actually.
Yeah.
So it's a bit abnormal at the moment. And I think part of it's because of the COVID hiatus, when there was a time when not a lot of rents were able to be put up, and then there were freezes and things like that. And of course, we're now through that. But it does show you how complex this is. And again, I think often the media really just doesn't do justice to the subject. Final point I'd make on the investment side is, if you look at most net returns in terms of cash flow, most net after the costs of the mortgage and everything else and repairs are very, very low. I mean, it's, if you get 1 or 2%, you're doing really, really well. So it's not like many people are actually making masses amount out of it at the moment. And that's something else that many investors are quite shocked about when you actually sit down with them and do the calculation. Okay, so let's actually look, what are you paying in the way of mortgage? What are you paying in the way of repairs, et cetera, et cetera. And the gross number, which is obviously the relationship between the cost of the property and the rent, doesn't tell you anything, right? It's actually the net that's the important one.
Well, it is, and what is important though with an investment property is that you consider the capital growth side of things. Otherwise, you'd never put up with such a woeful return. But there's also, on the flip side of that, you've got this pressure in various corners of the market that really promote this idea of buying for yield. And particularly when prices are falling, that's very dangerous because, of course, yield goes up as prices fall, particularly if rents are rising as well. And that can hide a poor asset that actually doesn't go up in value. So the whole calculation on a return on your investment when you're buying an investment property has to take into consideration both aspects. But very rarely does that happen.
Absolutely. Well, all of the portals will just quote you the gross returns. And as you say, when prices fall, they go up, which is not actually the right story. Now, Cookie Boy threw this comment a little while ago. Is Veronica seeing any signs of panic selling since the rate rises? Panic selling?
No. And the reason I'm not seeing it is because, of course, so I've got 4 sort of businesses, ridiculous. My buyer's agency, right, is based in Balmain in Sydney, And we operate within the 10K radius of Sydney CBD. So the lower North Shore, the eastern suburbs, and the inner west. Now, those are areas that are they're blue chip areas, and they have quite a wide diversity of owners, and a lot of people that have owned for a long period of time, and a lot of people that have very small mortgages, and a lot of people that actually have no mortgages because they've owned for a long period of time. You've also got people that would have bought fairly recently with huge mortgages because property is expensive in these areas. So because you've got that diversity of stock and ownership profile, you don't have this sort of panic selling, really. I have had one client who is a little bit more nervous than the average person, sort of go, oh my God, I bought at the peak, and interest rates are going up, and all of a sudden I said, well, let's just remember the long-term plan, the focus. This too shall pass, and a bit of short-term pain. And, you might need to pull in your belt buckle a little bit and budget a bit tighter, yes. And you might need to talk to your broker about, well, should I fix or should I not fix, and look at ways of managing your cash flow. But you've got a good asset, and you bought a good asset because you really wanted to shore up your future financial situation, and you're talking about holding it for 10 or 20 years. And we know it's a good asset. So just, take a deep breath, meditate your way through it. And that really is the only conversation I've had with someone who was a bit panicked. And it's more a personality trait, I'd say. However, I do observe, and I do read in forums. I do, hear stories of people who are freaking out and panicking. And I know that there are also areas that are much more prone to suffer acute mortgage stress and potentially will start panic selling. So, and it comes back to that diversity of stock and also blue chip area. And I get that it's very expensive stock, but it doesn't always have to be expensive. As I said, it's that diversity of ownership and a long tail, if you like, of people that could have owned it 20 years, 30 years, 10 years, 15 years, 5 years, and so on. So you're not sort of stuck with a whole bunch of owners all having similar debt profiles and all having similar equity. That's risky.
Absolutely. And in terms of the panic, I mean, there are definitely people feeling uncomfortable because of rising interest rates. And I was, again, talking to some people the other day who bought just over 9 months ago, so pretty much at the top. And they got a fixed rate mortgage of 2% when they bought. That was for 12 months. And it's now just coming up to the first reset. And they're now looking at a rate of probably moving from 2 to about 4.5 or maybe 5%. And so they've just done the calculations based on what that means in terms of their finances, and they're now saying, wow, this is way above what we thought. And whilst the bank said, sure, absolutely fine, and 3% buffer, they thought, well, that means we're going to be fine. The fact is they won't be fine, and they've got to actually do some hard thinking about what to do. They don't want to sell the property because it's too soon and the transaction cost of carry and things, but they're going to have to hunker down dramatically. And so the conversation went along the lines of, well, so how careful were you about what you bought? Is it really a good property, or is it not a good property? And that was a really interesting conversation because they actually had done their homework. So they actually had bought what I think would be an A-class property in an area that was not overly expensive.
Yeah,
it's going to serve them for 5 years at least, with their family plans, and so they can cope just. But the shock to the system is quite profound, and it goes back to this point about the buffers argument. People keep saying, "Oh, everybody's got buffers." No, I can tell you, in my analysis, some people do have buffers. A lot of other people don't have buffers, and so this average buffer story is masking these big differences between different types of people.
Well, absolutely. And first home buyers, and particularly anybody who bought their first property in the last, say, 12 to 18 months, is not necessarily going to have a buffer because they would have pulled all their resources to buy the property in the first place. And so, it's and in a rising market at that time when FOMO is rampant, people don't want to wait any longer to build that buffer before they buy because they want to get in there because they're worried the prices are going to continue to rise. And we know, you and I know, Martin, that these cycles come and they go, but you never know how long it's going to growth cycle is going to go for. And likewise, you never know how long the downwards cycle is going to go. So it is very uncomfortable. I recall, I'm old enough to remember the last recession, and
I can remember a few recessions.
So the recession of the 80s or the early 90s. And, I had a second job. I'd finished, while I was at uni, I worked in hospitality. And also when I had my first job, I continued working in hospitality to, pay for an overseas holiday. And I worked with people who had taken second jobs to pay their mortgage. Rates were up 17%, and I know that all the millennials hate it when, us Gen Xers bang on about this and the baby boomers. Oh, yeah, whatever. But it does demonstrate, I think, what Australians do if they are, given the option of losing their house or basically working harder to maintain it. It didn't stay forever and they didn't have to work 2 jobs forever. I tell you what, every bloody cafe and bar and restaurant is looking for staff at the moment. If I was in that situation, I'd go and take a second job. You'd have to. But I guess, we always think that this is going to, that these terrible things, it's going to be like this forever. They never are forever. And it really does come down to, the confidence of whether you own a good asset or not. If you own a crap asset, do you really want to take on a second job to keep that? No, I think there's some hard conversations and hard decisions to be made. But then how to determine whether you've bought yourself a crap asset or not? That's the problem. And often people don't even think about that until, times get tough.
Well, you've led me wonderfully to the question which I was going to ask is let's define again for everybody the characteristics of a good property versus not a good property, because there's actually a list of things that you can sort of check down, aren't there?
There are. I mean, we score properties in my business at Good Deeds. We literally score every property that we evaluate before we buy it, and we're scoring it for its capital growth potential in the context of its area, right? So there will be some areas that are much stronger than others suburb wise, but within every suburb there are properties that, push come to shove, regardless of the market is doing, buyers want. This is the fundamental of what an A-grade property is. It's the sort of property, it doesn't have to be the waterfront. It doesn't have to be the most expensive property. In fact, quite the opposite. What you're wanting is the sort of property that a majority of buyers in that area would actually prioritise over other properties. So if you have 10 houses in a row and all in different streets with different aspects, different architectural styles, different condition, different layouts, different different natural light, all these sort of things that buyers look for and prioritise. If you've got a property that's got a bigger proportion of those aspects and all those characteristics that buyers in that area value, then you're going to have the type of property that people will fight for, particularly in a hot market. But in a slow market, they'll bypass all those B and C grade properties that have something wrong with them, and they'll prioritise those A grade properties. And that's what you want. And every area there's certain things that are universal, like north facing garden. Yeah. Tick, tick, tick. A good balance of indoor and outdoor, the right amount of living space for your bedrooms, the floor plan where your bathrooms are in the right spots, the kitchen and the living areas are in the right spots, natural light, not on the low side of the street. Obviously an outlook of some description. It doesn't have to be a view. It just has to be pleasant, surroundings. Walking distance to shops and transport, not on the doorstep of shops and transport. No main roads. There's all these characteristics which are really no-brainers. They're not difficult to work out, but you do have to pay a little bit of time and attention to what really is valued in the local area you're looking at buying, because I often see a buyer come from one area where one type of property is valued, for instance, go to another and see one that's a bit unique for that area and it's more like where they came from, but the local buyers don't like it. And they go and pay overs for it because they love it. Oh, I love that property. It's unique in all the wrong ways, So you've really got to understand what the local buyers are paying a premium for and prepared to pay a premium for. And that fundamentally is an A-grade property.
Yes, that's exactly right. So A grade is defined some of those parameters. I'd also make the point, I think, that, different locations will be defined differently, right, in some of those things. But so there are some universal principles, like, for example, the direction it faces. It's actually quite important, in terms of which way the light comes in, when does the light come in, and those sorts of things. Sometimes people go on a cloudy day and don't realise that actually that's an issue, right? Another interesting one is, how quiet is the neighbourhood? Because, generally people prefer quieter neighbourhoods than not. And therefore, it's important to check the neighbourhood out, not just, on a Sunday morning, right? But other times of the day and night too. And it's amazing what you find when you do that. So, there's a whole bunch of things you have to do if you're going to really check it out and make sure that what you've got is an A rather than a B or a C, right?
Yeah.
Now, I know we talk about dogs, but every time I talk about dogs, I have to think about these guys, right? So, so yeah, I'll just talk about A's and B's, right? Rather than the dogs and stars. But but the point is, not all properties are the same, all right?
Absolutely not.
The other point is uniqueness. It's something which I keep coming back to, right? If there are 100 properties all the same, right, you are in a very different situation than if you've got a property that's relatively unusual and it might be well designed and hopefully in good location. But uniqueness is also quite important, I think.
Yes, and you got scarcity is a golden rule in property, right? Whereas and uniqueness is very important. However, you don't want it so unique that you're the only person that likes it. You want unique features that lots of people like. That's the difference, right? And I know that some people go and buy a property that's just so out there and so weird, and then it's like this is Megan. So my my partner at Home Buyer Academy, and we do the Your First Home Buyer Guide podcast. She likes to put in the screen, the video behind her, pictures of unusual houses, right? And there's one she put up there. I call it the eyeball house. It's up in Queensland somewhere. They were trying to sell it. I mean, honestly, who on earth? It looks like a cluster of eyeballs. It's so disgusting. Architect designed and an engineering masterpiece. All these circular rooms everywhere, but how hideous. And literally, you've got to find the one and only other person on the whole planet that would think that's beautiful. If you try to sell that house,
it's a bit like your own baby was the beautiful baby, right?
Yes.
But the point is that you do need to be a little bit careful, and there are these one-off architecturally designed monstrosities that nobody else wants to buy, and that's just the way of it. But there's also, if you've got something that's a little bit unusual with that's characterful in whatever way, and is not one of 100 or one of 1,000. I mean, think of high-rise apartments, right? What distinguishes level 30 from level 31 other than...
Exactly right. Nothing.
No. So how many of those are on the market at the same time? Well, if everybody's trying to sell at the same time, as North Ryde, I keep going back to North Ryde, is a classic case where they've got prices now lower than 2017 for apartments in North Ryde. Right? Hundreds and hundreds of these things all over the place, right? But there's no differentiation. They're all precisely the same, and actually no wonder that prices are going down. That's a really architectural, archetypal example of what goes wrong if you're not very careful.
Absolutely. There's like 16 or 17 suburbs in each Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, all with unit price, median price, and there's a danger in looking at that, by the way, all with a median price that is less than they were in 2017. And a lot, the lion's share of those suburbs, not all, but the lion's share of them are places like North Ryde, where you've just got building after building after building of very same cookie cutter type properties. There's nothing there's no upward pressure on prices at all. So, there might be now less than they were in 2017. Well, what are they going to be like in 5 years' time? At best, you probably plateau, but if there's more buildings to come, that's not on, odds are that they won't plateau, they'll continue to fall. And look, the other thing too is some of these areas have actually seen an increase because in 2021, it got to the point where houses became so unaffordable, then people started desperately turning to buy apartments, and all of a sudden there was a little bit of an upward lift on prices. But that goes back to my thing about an A-grade property. It's when the market turns, what are people going to want to buy? And if they're only buying a property because they can't afford it in a rising market, they can't afford better in a rising market, they will drop that like a hot cake the minute they can afford something better. Yep. And so, interestingly enough, too, about the whole scarcity and uniqueness thing. So, for instance, family homes with north-facing backyards, they do turn over less often than family homes with south-facing backyards. So, and the reason is whether the north-facing backyard people are conscious of it or not, it's that they don't feel uncomfortable in their home in any way. And so they don't sort of feel this pressure to get to do better. And it's like people buying main roads. The main road properties transact more often than the properties on quiet streets. And that's because it annoys can I swear? The shit out of you living on a busy road, So the things that people will put up with because they're paranoid in a rising market that they're going to miss out. They'll go, okay, it's got to get in. And they're precisely the same sort of things that actually weigh on them and make them want to get out of that property a lot sooner than they would if they actually had bought, even in the next suburb. If they could afford better in the next suburb, they should go to the next suburb.
Exactly right. Again, it shows you the complexity. And it's actually a very good time. There was a question from Sandy, it came in a couple of days ago. So they're a first-time buyer who were ready to buy. They've got 20% deposit, which is good, right?
Wow.
They went to the bank, and in late March, they got an in-principle mortgage. They went back to the bank last week and discovered that the bank now has dropped their borrowing power by 20%.
Wow. And they've got a 20% deposit.
They got a 20% deposit, but it's still down by 20%. So the question was along the lines of, well, it seems impossible, right? We thought we just about got there. We deliberately, build a big deposit because we didn't want to have to pay lender's mortgage insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And now the ground has shifted, and suddenly we've got less ability to borrow than previously. So effectively, we've now gone backwards again, right? And so the bottom line of the question was, are first-time buyers ever going to be able to get back into the market, or is it always going to be out of reach because they've been trying for 3 years to get into the market?
That's such an interesting question. I hadn't actually considered that could happen. I mean, obviously, I know your borrowing power is reduced as interest rates go up. I absolutely know that. But that is interesting to say that now that prices are falling, they're not able to take advantage of it because of this interest rate issue, and that impedes their borrowing capacity to that degree. It seems like a lot. Just in Chris Bates, who's my mortgage broker co-host of The Elephant in the Room. Yeah. I mean, he was talking about the impact to borrowing capacity of each interest rate rise. And that seems like a lot, to be honest. And I would be saying, hopefully you're talking to a broker, not directly with the bank, because the bank might have just changed a policy and that impacts you, but you actually find that your borrowing capacity and other banks is not impacted in the same way. So
I think you made a really interesting point there, because my sort of immediate reaction was, I wonder whether it's something to do with the area they were looking.
That too.
Is there some externality? For example, we know that portfolio risk has started to rear its head again.
Yeah.
And so there are some suburbs where banks have just said, we're not going to lend anymore. They're looking for reasons not to lend rather than to lend. So it could be that particular lender has actually just changed the rules and is using borrowing power as effectively a way of getting out of the transaction. So my suggestion is, absolutely with you, Veronica, shop around and see whether in fact you get the same news on the borrowing power elsewhere. There is some variability among lenders at the moment with regard to borrowing power, but it is reducing. It is definitely reducing.
Yeah, that's true. They are fighting for business too. So, there's a bit of a war out there. It's quite interesting actually. Look, today I was reading an article where some fixed rates are falling in some banks. So
the CBA dropped their 4-year rate quite significantly because the yield curve has now done that further out. So they're reacting to that. But they could react again the other way. So who knows exactly how this is going to play out. But
I do tend to keep a bit of a little bit of a watching brief on the bank's forecasts on interest rates at the moment, because we do that full forecaster report every year for the Elephant in the Room podcast, and in the past we've always been tracking the forecasts of prices. And this next year, so we release it on April Fool's Day every year. Next year, and I'm tracking interest rate predictions this time around. This is something a bit different, so it's quite fascinating. So and they're bouncing all around the place because like their inputs that they're using in their forecasting modelling and there's a lot of inconsistencies, and all the tried and true patterns that have been, well established in the past, they're not necessarily working in tandem anymore. The cause and effect doesn't seem to be all playing in according to the established rules. So the forecasting is rather interesting, and they're fixed rates, and because that's them betting on what they think is going to happen, isn't it? So,
well, it's based off what's called the implied forward rate. It's a mathematical relationship between where the yield curve is and where they're going to fund it. So it's a bit more than a guess. But the point is that if you go back 6 weeks, the yield curve was like that. Now it's like that. In other words, the prediction now is from the markets that prices will the cash rate will go up, and then it will come back down again, and in about 12 months' time will be on the other side of the hump. Now, that's a big assumption, right? Because it depends on what happens to the Fed. If the Fed goes on lifting rates higher, our yield curves will go on going up. And that's the problem, right? And it's interesting because this is translated now. A lot of the banks have started reporting their margins are getting squeezed dramatically, right? Because they're trying to wrestle with all of these moving feasts with regard to funding costs and deposit costs. And they're also not passing on much to depositors yet. So they're trying to save a bit there. So it's got really complicated. And that's really one of the things I wanted to sort of highlight in the conversation today. I don't think I've ever known a time when there are so many complications and so many variables up in the air at the same time. Inflation, interest rates, yield curves, China, Ukraine, and oil, gas. It's just on the gas thing, the RBA in their statement on monetary policy highlighted the risks for inflation from high gas prices ahead. Right, that's something else to factor into our thinking in terms of how quickly inflation will come down. In other words, how soon will the RBA be able to reduce rates? So it's very complicated to try and then make predictions. And somebody asked me on one of the interviews I was doing on the radio as to whether fixed rates make sense. And I said the only reason I'd go fixed at the moment is if you wanted to lock in certainty. So you knew for sure what your payment will be over 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Don't assume it's going to be the cheapest, the best value, but at least it gives you certainty. But that's the only reason I'd do it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I like to hedge my bets a little bit. I've always, kept some variable and locked in some. But I remember my first mortgage, I felt very clever that I managed to lock in, I think, half of it at 9.85%. But back then, fixed rates were higher than variable rates.
Yes.
And I've noticed that at the moment. In some cases, and I could be wrong here, but in some cases I seem to see a little bit of that creeping in finally. And that's how it should be, isn't it? Because you're taking the risk. I mean, that's sort of I could never understand how fixed rates could be less than variable. It didn't make sense to me.
That was because they were, again, implied forward rate was that rates were going to drop, so therefore they could afford to be
I'm
on
not
the
a
other
banker.
No, but that's the reason. So there is a mathematical relationship. But the banks put their fixed rates up dramatically high because they didn't want people taking fixed. They wanted them to take variable because of the uncertainty. So they were outsourcing the uncertainty to borrowers.
Right.
That's why they did it.
Yeah. Okay. And, like I know I've a couple of times I've had fixed rates sitting and much higher than variable, but that's the price I paid for certainty. So like you say.
Exactly. And I often say, well, if certainty is what you need, then fixed is the way to go. But don't assume it's going to be the best possible shiny rate that you can get, because by definition, there's a level of uncertainty wrapped around it. Now, here was an interesting question from a little while ago from Heath. Do off-grid homes sell for more due to no energy bills?
Now, this is a really interesting question because the short answer is I don't know, but the long answer is where are off-grid homes typically located? And if they are located in your regular urban area, I would like to think that over time they will sell for more. There has been some studies done in the US saying that energy efficient homes get a premium, but I think they've been sponsored by corporations who manufacture sustainable home additions. So I haven't ever seen any data that I think is would be peer reviewed, put it that way, would survive peer review. But because I also don't think consumers until recently in this country have actually been stung by high energy bills. So I don't think that the pain has been great enough for people to be prepared to pay for more for a sustainable home, even though there's been a lot of claims to the contrary. Also, I think that at the moment, we are moving more into mainstream in terms of demands for sustainability, but up until very recently, I don't think enough people have taken it seriously. And I think our federal election has been an interesting one too, because it's the first time the Greens have had so many seats in the upper house and the lower house. And even Queenslanders, going from Liberal seats to Green seats. What is that? So they are Brisbagans, of course, but this is the first time I think that Australians, because of all the floods and the bushfires, I think and obviously our energy bills as well, I think it's the first time Australians have really thought, oh God, we're pretty vulnerable here. And so I think there is a lot more awareness coming. And so I'm hoping that will be the case. But my short answer is, as I said, I don't know, but I suspect not yet.
No, I think it's very marginal, from what I've seen. And, the degree to which you can actually completely cover the energy cost is an interesting question. Some can, some can't, depending on the facilities, whether you've got batteries or not, whether you haven't got. How long the batteries will last is another question, which people sometimes start getting into, and how efficient the solar is, and what the inflow tariffs are. All those things come into it. So it's a very complicated thing to try and understand. It's a bit like access to NBN, It's quite interesting because somebody asked me the other day, well, is there much benefit in having, a good NBN versus a not good NBN? Because there were basically two properties on opposite side of the streets, and one side had fibre to the premise, the other one had fibre to the node and, cable up to it, right? And trying to work out whether, in fact, that was worth anything. Now, the answer is marginally yes, but again, I don't think it's a significant enough difference to make a huge difference to the value of the property.
I think if people have got two properties they're looking at side by side, and they really love one and it's not energy efficient, and the other one is in a different street, it's not their first choice, I think they'll still go for the house that they love before they'll go for energy efficient. I don't think it's yet at that point where people forego other things for it. It's a shame in a way, but I just think that's just the way it is.
It'll probably get there because I think the cost of energy is going to go through the roof. According to that RBA report, I know. It's going to be horrible, horrible, horrible. And in the UK, the energy is doubling. It's going from something like £2,000 per annum as a cap to £4,000 per annum over the next year. That's a big chunk of income for people. Some people are now spending 30% of their total income just on energy. So it suddenly is becoming a big issue. So I'm not saying it could be the same here yet, but we're going in that direction because we are actually exposed to those global gas prices.
Yeah. Well, when I renovated my house, I got all the wiring set up for solar, but I didn't actually get the solar panels. And when I went to make inquiries, I've discovered that because I've got this big tree in my neighbour's across the lane, that it was recommended. Well, the solar's probably, you can't really have solar, which I was very disappointed about. Actually, it's like lovely to have a big tree, but it's a bit of there's a unit block very close to me, and I really wondering if I can. I've actually just been thinking about doing this and researching, having those little community power station that you basically go and get the unit block to agree to use their entire roof, and that all the surrounding neighbours make a contribution and fund it. So I know things like that have been done, and they've actually been done, not too far away from where I live. So I'm going to look into that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, I've got the same problem here. So I'm surrounded by trees on three sides. I've also got a barrel roof.
Oh.
And barrel roofs are very hard to put panels on. So the only way to deal with that is you have to have a particular sort of inverter that allows each of the panels to be controlled independently, which increase the cost as the shade moves around. And then they can't attach panels to a barrel roof easily. So the cost went And so I said, well, okay, I'll just
ruin the aesthetic too. You got this sort of hard angle thing stuck on your curved roof.
Exactly. So it's like a lot of things. What you think is simple and straightforward may be a little more complicated. Again, but again, you've got to do the research. And I tell you, there were people bullshitting on all sorts of these solar schemes, and claiming it was great. Then they look at the actual situation and they go all quiet. So. Moral of the story is shop around. Now, Jason, thank you very much for the super chat. Just going back to the one-offs where the architect makes a name but no one wants it. Upper pressure on prices comes from increasing M2 value. Now, I don't know what M2 value is, Jason. You might have to explain unless you know, Veronica. Purely price for space in a suburb isn't, whilst noting some suburbs are worth more for the same space. So why is that? So I think that's the square footage, right? It's all the square meterage. So there is this theory about you can actually calculate the value of a property from the square meters. I'm a bit skeptical personally.
No. Look, you might be able to do that with apartments where, once again, they're very homogenous. Or you might be able to do it with, in house and land packages where all the stock is homogenous. So I wouldn't be recommending you buy there anyway, so don't waste your time trying to work it out, the dollar per square metre. I've seen it done. There have been very rare times when we've used that as one of the tools that we look at, because we're just trying, where the property is particularly hard to price, particularly unique. It's just one of the things that you can consider. But honestly, residential property, dollar per square metre is not the way to price it or value it. The interesting that you say about the architects that, make a name, and there is a thing called stylistically bound, and that is with certain architects, they have one way of design. It's like a brand, and that's fine. And you get people go, oh, I've got X. I'm not going to name anybody, but there's a few that I've particularly roll my eyes over when I see their name attached to a property. And they design for the aesthetic. It's form follows it's function follows form in that regard. And what really annoys me, and one particular one who's since deceased, and he's a very, very well-known architect in Australia. And I actually was called into, when I was a sales agent, to price up a small development of townhouses in a harbourfront location some years back. And I looked at them, at the design and, the size and the aspect and et cetera. And there was that each of these properties had a terrace, and each terrace was curved. And the way that they were curved meant you actually couldn't put any furniture out in these terraces. And you're on the harbour. You're wanting to have your entertain out there, your balcony, whatever, your barbecue, your table and chairs, 8 people for dinner, whatever. But you definitely want to entertain and use these balconies. And I went back and I said, look, this is what I think in terms of pricing. However, they're all going to be difficult to sell. You might get kudos because it's got this person's name on it, but functionally, these are not designed in the way people want to live. Well, they never actually built them, by the way, but I was hauled off the job. The developer was told that if they were to use me as an agent, that he would not design the property.
Well, I think some architects, particularly go down a particular corridor, right, and see things in a particular way, and that's all they see. And you got to like it or love it. Right. I mean, there's some very interesting properties in Canberra that were actually all built and designed by, a very interesting architect. But they stand out like a sore thumb, right? So,
and look, there have been some studies done on architect design homes being underperformers, in terms of capital growth. Yep. So. For that exact reason, that they're designed really to make a statement. They're not designed to be particularly easy. They look nice, but they're not necessarily designed the way people want to live.
And the construction costs often mean that they've actually got an initial higher cost to try and cover as well. So you could well be paying more for something that actually the art works, but actually in terms of value, there's a different.
There's your dollar per square metre.
No, it's a Great point. Yeah, I mean, it just goes to show you again, this can get quite complicated. Now, so I've got a question here from Paul, and he said, "Look, the Labour government's talking about shared equity schemes, right? So that basically you buy a bit of a house. What's Veronica's thoughts? Is that a good idea? Is it not a good idea? Is it going to help or is it going to hinder?"
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so many policies out there to sort of supposedly help first home buyers get into the market. Because at the end of the day, the real way to help first home buyers into the market is to have prices fall, dramatically. But you've got 10 million voters that aren't going to be very happy with that. So therefore, for your 100,000 or your 160,000, first home buyers in a given year, you've got to come up with some policies that make it look like you're really trying to help them. So of all the policies, I don't mind the shared equity schemes for a number of reasons. And Victoria's got one that's already up and running. Why I don't mind them is they don't limit you to buying only new property. They do give you more. They do offer to buy a larger portion of a brand new property, which is sort of funny because that means the government's really being irresponsible with tax fund payers' money. But so therefore, they're not dictating what you can buy. There are obviously income caps and value caps. There's restrictions around how you repay that money, if you repay that money. So if you get to a point where and in fact, I'm hybriding a bit here, talking about the Victorian one merged in with the federal one. The Victorian program is currently in use, whereas the federal one I don't think has commenced yet. I don't think all the finer details have been teased out. But with the Victorian one, for instance, if you fail to comply, i.e. say your income increases over the threshold, then you do need to start paying it back, which is great. You pay all the costs, so that's something, all the stamp duty. The government doesn't give you the 30% discount on stamp duty or whatever. But what I do think it does do, it does give you, as distinct from the 5% home loan deposit guarantee, if you go in with that, you've got to borrow 95% of that property, right? You've got a greater risk of negative equity, and also you've got a bigger mortgage. And as interest rates rise and borrowing capacities contract, then your 5%, your 95% is of a smaller amount of money. It basically means that it's riskier, the home loan deposit scheme, because of that. Whereas at least with the shared equity, you are borrowing a smaller amount of money. It's more manageable. You can potentially buy a bigger home, so that's going to last you longer. So I think that there's some really good things about it in terms of giving people the opportunity to get into the market sooner if all things else are, everything else being good, but also, limiting their exposure in terms of their mortgage repayments and giving them the opportunity to buy a better asset potentially than they'd be buying if they were purely relying on their own steam. So, like with everything, there's caveats. You've got to be very careful what you buy. But I don't think it's a bad idea. It doesn't help supply though, and that really is part of the problem too, right? Supply
is definitely part of the problem. In the UK experience, they've been using shared equity for quite some time. Three things. One is banks tended to charge them more for the mortgage because there was more risks attached, right?
Oh, God,
in their mind. Yeah. Secondly, the concept of the value going up was sort of implicit in the model. And a lot of the properties that were actually shared equity properties, the value didn't go up over the following 5 years. So it didn't quite work. And then the third one is they also had quite complex exit strategies. So in certain circumstances, if your income changed, you were forced to effectively buy out the other share of it. So I think it's all in the small print, and I'll be interested to see how the federal one comes out. But my view is this is such a small element in the overall picture.
Well, it is, because the amount of places that they're offering is a very small percentage of the total property market. I mean, something like 600,000 properties are sold every year in Australia on average, and is it 10,000 shared equity schemes? I think from memory, I didn't check my numbers, but it's a tiny, tiny percentage of the whole market. Yep. So, yes, so we can sort of argue, and I have argued, I said, does it just increases supply, probably brings forward some purchases, but in the whole overall scheme of things, it's probably not going to make much of a dent into the market.
Yep.
I wouldn't think.
Absolutely. All right, now this one from Susan. So she said, help. We bought. It's actually a property in Sydney. It's a house. They bought about a year ago, and they've just had a valuation, and they've lost about 12% of the value of the property. So they're in negative equity. They've got a very high mortgage. So they're sitting here and now in negative equity with prices essentially looking as though they'll go down further. And so the help, she says, can you help me understand how serious is negative equity?
Well, it's only serious if you've got to sell it. Obviously, it's a highly uncomfortable position to be in, knowing that you and look, this is the way you would think, right? I'm not necessarily saying that you should use this language to yourself, and I'm not necessarily saying I agree with this. So I'll say how, I can imagine most people think, oh, I overpaid it. I paid it. I bought it at the peak. I'm an idiot. Oh my God. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I've lost money. All these things will be going through your mind, right? And it is really hard to slow down and just try to reassure yourself under those circumstances, especially when interest rates are rising and potentially your costs are going up. Yep. So negative equity really is a risk if you have to sell it, but also if it's always going to be that way. And when I say always going to be that way, that's when it comes down to the quality of the asset that you bought. If you bought a property like these cookie cutter apartments, if you bought a property that is not going to grow for the foreseeable future, and not because of the market, but because of the property it is, then negative equity is a problem. And you might decide to get out, cut your losses and get out. But if you bought a good asset, that will be fine. You just got to write it out because everything's falling at the moment. And also, just because you had a valuation doesn't necessarily mean that that's exactly what it would sell for either. No. A lot of people sort of have a lot of myth. There's a lot of myths around bank valuations. And one of them is that, banks always value low. That's a myth. Another one is that, it's what somebody will pay for the property, because at the end of the day, the purpose of a bank valuation is very different to the purpose of trying to work out really what it's going to sell for. So they're two different things. You would think they're the same, but they're not. So I think because of all that, and also because valuers are fallible as well, and it might be that you have got a crap asset and you do have to make some really hard calls. There's no doubt about that. But it also might be that you just got to write it out, and you got to remember the long term. You got to remember why you bought it. You got to remember how long you thought you were going to live there, how long it will suit your needs. Hopefully it's not 2 years, and hopefully you don't get divorced. These are very real things that do happen to people. But generally speaking, if you had a long-term view and you bought a good asset, just write it out.
Yeah, and I think what I always say in that situation is don't panic. The first thing is don't panic, right? It's not like I can't afford to make my monthly repayments, right? If you can't afford to make your monthly repayments, that is serious, because you've got to do something, and you've got to do something immediately, because if you don't, you're going to get into terrible trouble one way or the other, right? With a negative equity situation, it actually is not so serious unless you need to sell or forced to sell, right? If you can continue to make your monthly repayments on the mortgage, and particularly if you've got, as you say, a property that's reasonable, you can ride it through. And there are people in the UK who were in negative equity for about 8 or 9 years after the global financial crisis. They still went on paying their mortgage. Unfortunately, you may end up paying a higher rate on the mortgage, because quite often the bank, when they actually come to reassess the mortgage every few years, they might actually think it's higher risk and they might charge you more. So you might not get the best mortgage, so you might have to pay more. That's worth thinking about. The other point there is that it will give you less flexibility. It's very hard to move with negative equity unless you can get a bank who's prepared to transfer the negative value to the next deal. And some, well, occasionally are, but it's not done often. So you're probably locked into the property, right? Locked into the property, continue to pay. But if in fact you've got a bad asset and it's going to continue to fall, that's the question you've got to ask yourself. Because if it's on the way down and you're going to lose more value, the pain point question is, at what point are you better to cut your losses? And that's a really tough question, isn't it?
It's a hugely tough question, and as human beings, this is a bias called loss aversion. We hate to lose far more than we like to win, and also recognize. I guess you're feeling loss anyway already just because of the valuation. But if you, the idea of actually realizing that loss is extraordinarily painful. There have been plenty of investors that should have cut and run because they've made mistakes. But when you're living in it, it's a very different equation, because there's value or utility in having a home. You're going to have to pay rent anyway. So you've got to sort of put a lot of other aspects into the whole decision-making equation if you're living in the property.
Yeah, and that's why it's a tough thing to do. I think the other thing I would say to people in this situation, sometimes don't keep looking up the value.
Oh my God, no. It's I had a friend who she had this share portfolio, and then she went and bought some Bitcoin, and she was every single day she's looking at it. I thought, oh, God's sake, stop looking at it. It's gone up. I've made $6,000. I've lost $6,000. This sort of volatility and daily, and to do that with property would just send you nuts. And this is one of the beauties of property. It's lumpy. It's called a lumpy asset. You're not meant to have a daily view, a daily price check on your property. It's sort of better. Ignorance is bliss sometimes.
Well, and of course, all these indices that keep going up and down and being quoted left, right, and centre, they're averages anyway. They don't tell you much at all, right?
My God, yes. I yelling it every single time I see one of those top 10 lists in a newspaper article or online article about, the top 10 suburbs where prices have moved the most. And it does not take much analysis to go, oh, right, well, there's only been 12 sales in the last 12 months. That's so unreliable. It's statistically insignificant. Or there's a huge distribution of property types and values in that particular suburb. It's ridiculous. All you need is a few waterfronts to sell and the price rockets up 20%. It's just stupid. And this goes back to the journalists not actually using any integrity, any investigative powers whatsoever when they get these lists. It's, oh God, here we go again. Anyway.
Well, I'll just no, it's a very important rant, because I give this example, right? So, if you actually, in an area and suddenly, the richest man in the world comes to live next door, right? The average income for
yes,
that
it goes up.
goes massively up, right? However, the median, the one in the middle, wouldn't change at all, right? It's precisely the same with property. You've got to understand how some of these indices are actually working, because if you have a lot of sales at the top end of the market, for example, that can distort the indices overall for that particular area, all right? And
at the lower end, and we're actually seeing this at the moment in terms of price movement and some of the, the aggregate data on a suburb level, that there are, it's anecdotally, right, I'm seeing at the higher end of the market, it's actually very, very strong. It doesn't mean that you're getting huge competition and crazy prices. They're still quite careful with their money, but there's money there and they're spending it on the right properties, right? Yep. And at the lower end of some of these markets, I'm seeing that the competition is vanished, because it's, if they're the C-grade properties in a suburb, for instance, nobody wants them. So they're the sort of properties that are really selling at a bargain, if they're selling at all, and they might be withdrawn from market. So that's distorting the data. And yet, actually, a lot of the official data is saying that the top end is suffering more. And I'm wondering if that's just because there's more properties.
There's more transactions.
The price.
Correct.
Well, they're moving they're moving from one percentile into another.
Yep.
You know.
Correct. I think that's exactly right. And a lot of the analysis that's being reported so far, I think, is distorting what's really going on for those very reasons. And remember also that a lot of them data's lagged anyway because the settlement data doesn't come through for 6 to 8 weeks after, if you're lucky, sometimes more lag than that. So I always say to people, those indices are more deceitful than helpful.
They are. And so, it's very difficult and particularly in times when, things are going crazy. Everyone goes, how much have I made? And then things go bad. And, oh my God, the fear factor. I don't know. Once you've made a commitment to a property, as long as you've made it for all the right reasons, you honestly should unplug yourself. Just don't look.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that just let it be for a bit, It'll still be there. Right? Yeah. That's the beauty of property. You at least know that in the medium term it's still going to be there. Okay, last question from the beforehand. This particular lady heard you talking about granny flats, I think last time you were on.
Oh. Have you
changed your view, given now where property's going? Is granny flats more or less of an option given the lack of supply and the fact that property prices are turning over?
No, I haven't changed my view. I still think putting a granny flat on a lot of properties is like stitching an extra leg on a horse and thinking it's going to run faster. I still think that. I can understand why people will be going, oh my God, there's a rental shortage. I'm going to go and plonk a granny flat at my backyard because I can make an extra buck. I get that. I still think it's going to devalue most properties. So, I'm all for providing more rental accommodation. And if you want to do it, knock yourself out. But it doesn't change my my assessment of it as an individual strategy for most individuals.
Right, good. So let's just be clear. It still has the potential to destroy value rather than create value, right?
Yes.
Not least because you've suddenly nicked a corner of the garden or you've, put something in the middle of the view or whatever, right?
Yeah, you've made your garden less usable. You've also introduced a privacy element or lack of privacy element to your property. There's a whole bunch of reasons why it becomes problematic. So if you've got the right sort of property and it's big enough and you can hive off a corner and you won't even notice, then absolutely knock yourself out. Take advantage of that. But majority of the properties that these are plonked on, they're awful.
Exactly right. They were pretty bad before and now they get even worse. Yeah, no, very good. Okay, well, that's pretty much the end of the questions. Now, in terms of from this point forward, what are the things that you're looking for in terms of, the next turns in the market? How are you seeing this playing out over the next few months?
Well, it's interesting, we're talking earlier about the anomalies. We didn't use that word, but in data, for instance, there's always anomalies. Like, for instance, you've got consumer confidence at an all-time low. It's now as low as it was, in April 2020, right? And yet you've got spending still high. And you and I were talking off air about this, Martin. If you dug like anything, we're looking at aggregate data, and then you dig deeper, you find that different segments are spending and others are not spending. Right. And it's a little bit like the whole property market at the moment. There's a lot of negativity out there in the press, huge amount, ridiculous amount. In fact, it's just getting a bit stupid. When you look at the underlying numbers of the property market in this country, even though we'd say there is not one market, but, there's 10 million properties, value, $9.8 trillion or something, $2.1 trillion of that is borrowed. So the market has to fall a long way before we get into a situation where, the amount of debt is the same as the amount of equity. There are obviously segments. Just make a point there. That debt, of course, is not spread equally across all that. No, yeah, it's concentrated. Right?
So it's a sort of normal distribution curve, right? You've got a lot of people with little debt, and you've got a lot of people with a lot of debt, and unfortunately, minor movements with a lot of debt creates problems. Again, granularity is important.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, so it is concentrated in different areas that are obviously much more vulnerable to interest rate rises and market movements than others. But I guess what I'm saying about this is that whilst there's all this negativity out there, at open houses, there are lots of, in my area, okay, I can only talk about my area in a sense of a granular sense. At open houses, there are lots of people looking at property. Now, I have been in the property game now for 22 years. I've been in ups and I've been in downs. I have never been in a down market where there's so much negativity and prices are falling and open houses are busy. I can't work that one out. What that says to me is that humans at the moment, humans are weird anyway. So there's just, I think COVID has flushed out and thrown out every accepted rule that we've always sort of used as our yardsticks. I think COVID's just thrown it all out the window, right? So this is a different behavior. I've not seen this behavior before, where there's an interest in property, even though supposedly nobody's interested in buying property, right? And so I don't know. And I guess what I would say to you about, it's funny because at the beginning of lockdowns in March 2020, April 2020, we were doing like 2 podcast interviews a week, really trying to understand what could happen, right? Most people were talking the market down big time, 30% falls, using accepted economic theory and all the rest of it. And I thought to myself, and I did say, I'm happy I did say this, actually, it's been recorded. I said, at the end of all this, we might all just come out of the box like a greyhounds chasing bunnies, basically, bolting out of our front door saying, I am sick of being in this house. I hate this house. I want a bigger house, or I want a brighter house, or I don't want to be in this suburb anymore. I don't want to be in this family anymore. I just want to bolt out and change my life. And that's exactly what happened in the end, because human beings just en masse reacted to being locked up. Now, I think that that's sort of shaken us all up a bit, And so I think a lot of the standard ways that I've looked at the market, that a lot of experts and a lot of people that have been around a long time looked at the market, I think we're all up to having our preconceptions maybe shaken up a little bit. So therefore, I guess the short answer to that long preamble is that I don't know, but I don't think it's going to be down. My sense is it's not going to stay down. And I know that there's less money out there because the borrowing capacity is contained. I get that. But it's not like everybody was borrowing 6 times multiple of their income before. There's a bit of fat out there. There's a bit of I know a lot of people are suffering hardship, but I also know that the middle class in this country are doing pretty well, And the middle class are typically your property owners and people are buying property. So I think that there's a lot of negative talk, but I think when you actually look at some of the actual underlying data in terms of, the economic situation, but also in terms of individual families, more in the middle segment, I think that people will get on with it, to be honest. I think that they'll get used to these interest rates being higher. And I think we'll sort of go back to a bit of normality. That is my feeling, but it's purely a feeling. I don't have any data to back me up.
We don't need it. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, my observation would be that listings are up. The volume of transactions is falling in many areas, but there are still some weird transactions that are very strong.
Where are listings up? Because I'm not seeing listings up.
Well, if you look at the number of houses and apartments in the Greater Sydney area, they're higher than they were a year ago.
This is interesting, actually. So I track auction clearance rates, and I also track the percentage of properties that are listed for auction and been withdrawn, and also the auction listings volume, right? And at the beginning of the year, just in Sydney, I only do it in Sydney, so it's Sydney aggregate. Beginning of the year, as is typical at the beginning of the year, we have a lot of listings because there's pent-up demand for people wanting to sell their property. There's also pent-up demand from people wanting to buy property. And so then you've got, we had high clearance rates, for the first 6 weeks, I think, over 70%. And then we're sort of getting into Easter and it goes all wobbly then because Easter and school holidays and all the sort of weird things happen. The actual auction listings volume went all over the place. Clearance rates fell. The level of withdrawn listings started rising, got up to over 20% at one point. Over the last, say, 8 weeks, things have really stabilised. The numbers of listings has settled in between 400 and 500 per week. And I know it's only auction. I get that, excuse me, I get that there's a proportion that would come on private treaty. I also get this is property that's new listings, right? Not listings volume. There's two different things. And I'll get that distinction in a sec. But it's really interesting to see things that just plateaued. So the clearance rates plateaued in the early 50s, right? So it's just settled. The withdrawal rates plateaued around about 18%, and the auction listings is sitting between 400 and 500, which is significantly less than average, right? So average was, I think, around 600 to 700, right? So that's Sydney wide. I get that that's auction properties, and so that's partly some properties will come on private treaty rather than auction, so it's not total listings number. But if you look at SQM, which is what's his name, Louis Christopher's website, and he's got these charts there about listings volume. So there's new listings, so properties coming onto the market, that's falling. Total listings might be increasing because properties are taking longer to sell. But what his chart is really interesting because it splits it into periods of time that the properties have been on the market. So 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 180 days, 120 days, out to 180 days. So what you will see is that the 180 and the 120 days, that proportion of the market swells in a slower market. But the actual proportions that are turning over in normal periods, that remains roughly the same. And so what my sort of interpretation of that is that those longer listings, the ones that can't sell, that's all the C-grade crap that sells in a hot market because there's just FOMO and people forget to be picky. But in these market conditions, that adds to the total stock on the market, and that's all the shit no one wants anymore. Yep. That's my theory on that.
No, I think that's exactly right. And, it goes back to we keep saying you can't look at an aggregate, you got to go into the detail. But certainly down here in the Illawarra, there's less sold and prices are sliding. I can tell you that. Look, because I've been following the local here.
Yeah.
So
our transactions are down.
Correct.
There's no doubt about that. Yep. Yeah, but what I mean is that you got to sort of get in there and tease out and pull out the shit stuff that shouldn't have been selling for crazy prices anyway.
Well, that's another issue. Yes, indeed.
But there is less coming onto the market. I think that's really important. Yeah. Because that discretionary sales, this is people, and granted, there will be areas where this is not the case. There will be areas I mentioned before, high risk areas that are vulnerable to mortgage stress, where the stock's homogenous, and that means it's all the same. There are risk of And look, we see it in unit stock, actually. We do see it in those areas of oversupply. You do see that the volumes, the stock levels swell, and a lot of it is investor stock they're trying to offload. Yep. But certainly in areas that are not, they don't have that problem of oversupply of new stock, we are seeing listings numbers reduce markedly, and the listings of A-grade properties, they all but dry up. It becomes even harder to buy good property in a buyer's market.
And I think that's the point. If you look at the quality of what's on, I think the number of really good properties has definitely evaporated. Yeah. Because they're not forced to sell. Mm-hmm. A lot of the stuff that's coming through are property investment type property where people are feeling, well, I've made a bit, I should get out before it falls. Yeah. A lot of apartments in particular, I'm seeing that coming through in spades as well. So it is a very interesting, and it goes back to what we said, it's complicated, right? It's really complicated, right? Yeah. Very interesting. Okay, now I ran a poll, and let me just tell you that the poll question was, in a year's time, will property prices on average be higher, lower, same, or can't tell, right? And on the show tonight, 14% of people thought that prices were going to be higher, 69% lower, 7% same, and 9% said they can't tell, and that's based on just over 300 votes. So there you go. That's what the audience thinks.
I'm with the 9%.
Am I totally surprised? No.
Fence sitter.
Well, I actually am of the view that it's very, very tough to call this at the moment.
Yeah.
I run 3 scenarios. One scenario is over 3 years, it's going to go up a little bit. Mm-hmm. My base case is down a little bit. And my worst case is down quite a lot. So I'm covering all the bases because I can't tell.
Be careful. You'll be quoted for 40% falls again.
Yeah, I'm expecting it, but you know.
You beg you.
As you know, you have to go into a bit more granularity to really understand what's going on. Veronica, I really have enjoyed chatting with you tonight. Thank you so much. I think we covered a lot of ground. I think we made some really, really important points for people, and I know it's been appreciated in the chat. So thank you very much for coming on. What's the best way for people to find out more about what you do? Because you've got so many different URLs and businesses. I'm completely confused. So where would you like to direct people?
It's actually, I'm actually redoing my website, which is veronicamorgan.com.au at the moment. It is alive and well, and you can contact me through there, but it doesn't give a good summary of everything that I do. So I'm going to just direct you to veronicamorgan.com.au, and in the meantime, or listen to The Elephant in the Room. I think if you're interested in I guess, deeper analysis and questioning and a bit more critical analysis, then, you know, and you really get off on this sort of stuff, then you wouldn't be listening to Martin. If you didn't, then you should be listening to the Elephant in the Room podcast. Yeah, I really need to get my website fixed so that it actually represents all the things that I'm working on. Wasn't obviously not a high priority.
No, well, I have to say the Elephant in the Room podcast I highly recommend. Not least because you guys interviewed me a few times, and you know I'm happy to come on again. So, but the point is, in terms of in-depth analysis and getting a wide range of inputs, I think there's nothing better. So, you know, I do recommend that. I'll put that link in the comments below as well.
Thank you. I will just sort of add very quickly that suburbhelp.com, that is. We're democratizing property data. So if you're doing what everyone else is thinking, which is like, I want to know where to buy, well, you need to really, you know, start somewhere. And, you know, we're starting from a place where we sort of create these data and these reports where we're trying to take the bullshit out of it all, right? So I'd encourage you to go and have a look at suburbhelp.com. And if you are a first home buyer in particular and you really want to learn how to buy property properly, because there are so many mistakes that you can make, as we've discussed. You know, you don't want to be one of those people that in a year's time goes, oh my God, did I buy a good one? You want to know you bought a good one, and you want to know you didn't overpay and you did all your due diligence. So I would just please go and check out homebuyeracademy.com.au, because that, you know, honestly, I'm so passionate about helping first home buyers not make those terrible mistakes, some of the ones that we've talked about tonight.
Absolutely. And, you know, like I say, you can regret at your leisure, but if you do the stuff on the way in, then yes, you don't make the mistakes. And it's, you know, not simple and not straightforward. It is worth taking the time to go through that checklist and really make the decisions on the right basis on the way in, because not all property is equal. And if you're on the wrong solution, you can actually end up in a very, very difficult situation, particularly in this sort of climate. So that's why this is such an important conversation.
Well, it is so avoidable, some of these mistakes people make. You know, Megan and I on the other podcast, too many things that I know. So on the Home Buyer Academy podcast, you know, we actually quite regularly will take a newspaper article that's some woe is me story about some poor first home buyer that's really, you know, made some huge error or been ripped off or whatever. And we go through and we dissect what the story is and how it could have been avoided. And it's every single situation. There are really dumb things that they did because people think that they know enough about property to be able to do it. They just don't know what they don't know. And we have this huge passion to stop people making dumb mistakes.
Exactly. It is, our mission, your mission, my mission, our missions separately and together to try and help people make better decisions. I think that's probably a very, very good way to sum it up. Thank you very much, Veronica. Appreciate it. We'll chat back in here in a few months and see how things have shaken out. Thank you very much. I'm going to take you offline and I'll just close the show. See you later.
Lovely. See ya.
So there you go, folks. I hopefully you found that useful. Really interesting points there, and I think very important ones. Just to tell you that next week I have Leith Van Onselen on. Here we're going to talk about the latest with regard to what he sees from an economic perspective, and that will be, I think, quite a useful conversation, bearing in mind everything that's currently going on. So mark your diary and join us again next week. And just before I go, I will just jump back to the doggies. They haven't moved. They've been there the whole time. So they're not going to buy property in the short term. So there you go. So, anyway, thank you very much for spending some time with us tonight. Really appreciate it. Have a good evening. Check our other shows during the week. There's a couple of really good ones coming up, interviewing Steve Van Meter tomorrow morning. So watch out for that one. And look forward to seeing you next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.